Hey guys, welcome back. Working on my other 4runner today. In one of my last few videos, we did the rear drive shaft U-joint, the rear joint on the rear shaft of my other 4runner, and I mentioned the double cardan joint. Well, on this 4runner, I believe that the double cardan joint, the inner bearing, is worn out. Now, I couldn't find the exact part. There's no part listing for this, but I did find one for like my 95 Toyota pickup. I'm hoping it's the same double cardan joint. Apparently 96 and up, they don't even list it. They just want you to buy a complete drive shaft. So if we get it apart and I don't have the right part, then I'll probably just get a used drive shaft and go from there. But we'll see if we can take it apart. Now, what I have is I have a vibration going down the highway. It changes if I'm accelerating, decelerating. At low speeds, like accelerating from a stoplight, I have a little bit of a thumping noise. But there's no like obvious play in the universal joints like we had in that last video. I guess there was no play in that one. That was a tight joint. But let me show you one spot I did find some play in the double cardan joint. So I don't have any play, you know, just twisting it side to side. But what I found is if I push up on it, which I may have to get this camera on a tripod to be able to see it, I do get some up and down movement, which there shouldn't be because there's a center bearing that's supposed to hold everything tight, and I have a feeling that center bearing is getting worn out. So hopefully you can see that slight movement. Typically on these joints, you don't get that up and down movement. More than likely the center bearing is worn out. That's the part that's hard to find. The U-joints, I actually didn't find a listing on these U-joints either. I have two different U-joints that I had for my other truck. So hopefully those are correct. Really, we'll take them apart, we'll measure them, see if the ones I have match up. Hopefully the center bearing is correct. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull this drive shaft out. We'll take this front section apart, see if I have the correct parts to put it back together. If I do, we'll go ahead and do the rear U-joint as well. Since I have the shaft out, may as well do that one. They're fairly inexpensive. Okay, now those that aren't familiar with the double cardan joint, it's two sets of, or two U-joints, and then there's a center pivot point. And one thing that a U-joint causes is it causes a change in velocity of the drive shaft as it pivots. So if we're straight on with a single U-joint, the drive shaft is going to maintain the same speed from our input through the shaft, and if our output was the same angle, then that would maintain the same speed as well. But as soon as we start changing the angle of it, this drive shaft is going to speed up and slow down kind of on a elliptical pattern. Velocity is going to, you know, rise and drop depending on the angle. But with the double cardan joint, actually any U-joints, if your output angle is the same as your input angle, the input and output will match each other even though the shaft is changing speed. So what they do with the double cardan joint is the two angles always match each other no matter what the angle is of the shaft, and they automatically cancel each other out. So that is the purpose of this. So this is actually a constant velocity joint. Now this doesn't look like a regular CV joint like what we have in a front wheel drive vehicle or even a four wheel drive vehicle with independent front suspension. You know, it doesn't have the retaining ring and a bunch of balls in there. We're using two U-joints to create a constant velocity joint. So to get this apart, this drive shaft has internal snap rings. There's lots of grease and stuff in here, so I'm gonna have to clean up the grease. Now, this grease zerk here, this is the grease zerk for that center pivot point. I'm gonna wanna take that grease zerk out if possible to prevent myself from breaking that off. It's kind of tight in there. So I think I'll have to take the grease zerk off of the adapter, the angled adapter, and then take the angled adapter out. Now, I haven't done a lot of these joints, so it's something I do struggle with a little bit. I don't know if there's an easier method. I normally use the hammer and vise method on these. I haven't had good luck doing these in a press or with a universal joint tool. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove all of the internal snap rings. There'll be 8 of them on this end of the drive shaft, and they're all internal. So we'll have to, that's why I cleaned up the grease a little bit. We'll pop them all loose and then we'll start pressing this out. Now, because this has that center pivot point, you essentially have to separate two joints at the same time, or it kind of works that way. So what I'm going to try and do first is separate the U-joints that go to the center section. And what that will allow me to do is, once I get the two caps off of the end yoke, then I can remove the end yoke and work with just the inner joint. But it may require me to take, 4 caps loose to get to that. If you haven't done it already, I mentioned it in my other video several times, go ahead and mark your drive shaft. You want everything to be lined up. I normally go wherever the grease zerks were, so I do a mark on my flange, my pinion flange, or the transmission flange, all the way along the drive shaft at every joint, so you can put it back together the same way you took it apart. So I'm going to start by supporting this flange in the vise, and I'm going to hammer down on this center yoke. But one thing that I forgot is, if we take this apart and forget our orientation of how this centerpiece is sitting in there, that may screw us up as well. So I'm just going to take a different color ink pen. I'll put a red mark up here so we can get that back together correctly. We're going to start with the brass hammer just so we don't beat stuff up too bad. If that is not powerful enough, we'll switch over to a dead blow hammer. So that joint is starting to come out, but since we're on the pivot point, I may need to start moving this joint out as well. So I'm just going to slide back in the vise. Now it's going to be a little difficult, but I'm going to support just this flange in the vise. I'll get this other joint started, and then we'll switch back to that first joint. So that moved quite a bit for us. I'll continue on this back joint, and as you can see, I'm kind of bound up now. It's not quite in the orientation it should be, and it could be because the joints are not separating at the same angle. Once I start moving this joint a little bit, it might level out. And it kind of looks like my U-joint is not pushing through quite properly here. So I'm going to flip it over and start going the other direction. And as I'm beating on this, I see that this cap is starting to come out on its own. So that one should come out fairly easy. And I guess really, whatever joints come apart the easiest, maybe the way we need to go. Oh, and those kind of slid right out of there. Wasn't planning for that either. Yeah, it wasn't the way I was planning on disassembling the whole thing, but this joint kind of wants to come apart. See if that's enough to separate this yoke off the end here. There we go. So we got the end yoke off. We can see that there is a shaft sticking out here and a spring. Don't lose that, because the new unit may not come with the spring. While this is still in the vise, I'm going to go ahead and knock the caps off the rest of the way. Now we'll continue on trying to remove these other caps far enough that we can get this cross piece separated from the drive shaft. Okay, and we still have this U-joint trapped in the drive shaft, and we're starting to see the inner workings of the mechanism. But I'm going to slide this back, set the vise down on just those cross pieces. Okay, now we can see the inner portion that I was concerned about. Now, most of the needle bearings fell out when I was hammering it apart, but this is what holds everything kind of centered together. So everything's pivoting on this center point, and then the universal joints are there to allow the flex. Now this is also on a socket, so it spins around, and then it has a bearing in the center. We are going to try and replace this. Hopefully I have the correct part. So there is a grease seal. If we roll this ball a little bit, we can get a screwdriver underneath there, hopefully, and pop out that grease seal. I don't remember if there's a snap ring on these or not. The kit should come with a new grease seal. And I do not see a snap ring in there. But I think the last one of these I did, I can't remember if I had to torch this ball out or if I was able to pop it loose. There we go. At least on this one, and it could be because it's worn out, the ball did come out of there. Now it fits fairly snug when it's in that position, but once you get it rotated, it kind of loosens up and will be easier to remove. Now I still need to get this outer race out, and unfortunately I don't have a blind hole puller set. So what I'm going to try and do is use my small slide hammer, and this is a tool I use for pilot bearings. It has just a 2-jaw internal jaw puller. There is a lip on the back of that race. I'll tighten that up, and hopefully that race will come out of there. No snap ring or anything that holds this in, it's just hammered in place. So now we need to find out if the new one that I bought is correct for this drive shaft, which I'm really hoping it is, because otherwise I took this drive shaft apart and don't have parts to put it back together. So here's what comes in the kit. We have a new ball, socket, seat, spring. It's kind of hard to see in there. There is a kind of a cardboard spacer inside of there that keeps all the rollers in place for shipping. We need to pluck that out. The spring will go in the end of the drive shaft. So we need to make sure we get that stuff out of there before we try to go back together. Otherwise, we're going to have some issues. But I will leave all that stuff in place while we install it, if it's the correct one. Now, outside diameter looks the same. I suppose we could mic it. The new one has a little lip, which it looks like would sit down in there properly. But since the old one didn't have that little lip on the outside edge, you know, we need to clean all the grease off of this yoke. Make sure that that step is nice and clean. It doesn't drop right in, which means it's not too small. So I'm going to find something. Actually, I could probably possibly use the old one as a driver for the new one, because I'm not going to have a driver that has an edge that thin. So we'll see if we can get this old driver to install the new one, or the old race. Okay, it didn't go in too hard. I had a little bit of resistance, so I think it fits properly. there is that cardboard sleeve and the spring. Now, I'm not quite ready for that yet, so I'm going to leave that in there to keep everything together. And we'll go ahead and get this one U-joint started before we put everything else together. Now, what's kind of popular in the off-road crowd is guys will take their drive shaft to a driveline shop, have them take it all apart, and then they take it home and they grind this edge down to give it a little more clearance. There's a few dents in mine where obviously the vehicle had overextended the flex and hit this edge here. So a lot of guys will clearance this a little more. Even though you get more water in there and the boot doesn't seal it as good, they'll give themselves more clearance to get a higher angle drive shaft. I'm hoping this joint is the correct one. It's a Napa 513. Where's my old joint? And I could measure it and check the spec book, but we'll just try doing a physical comparison. Now, even though the caps stick out a little further on this one, the snap ring looks like it's in the correct location, and that's where the measurement is from. Our caps appear to be the correct diameter, so it's probably the right joint. Now, this has a grease zerk in the end of the cap. We need to make sure we get that cap at the correct location, which is going to be on this side of the drive shaft because that's where my mark is. So that cap will get pressed into that cross piece at a later step. Now, this isn't quite as easy as the drive shaft I did the other day. We have to finagle these joints in here a little bit. Everything on the double cardan joints is a little more difficult. I'm going to get this bottom cap started first. So I have the cross piece sitting in there. I dropped the cross piece all the way down and got this cap started. I'm going to lay it flat on the bench. I'm going to tap on the top of the yoke. Now that I have it sort of started, flip it over. Tap that in like so. And then I'm going to overdrive that cap just a little bit. For one, it's going to make it easier to put the snap ring on. And two, it'll make it easier for me to get the cap on the other side without dropping any of the needle bearings. Snap ring is in place. You know, it probably wouldn't be too big of an issue, but I like lifting it up just slightly. I don't want to disengage the needle bearings on the bottom, but this allows me to engage the needle bearings at the top before hammering anything into place and prevents me from dropping any of those needle bearings. Now, as I drive this down, I'm squishing the cross piece and it's going to finish driving that other cap all the way down. That sounds like it's all the way there. See if we can get the snap ring in place. That'll kind of confirm that we have the correct joint. Okay, I think that is going to be a stopping point on this side. We need to prepare the other side and get it ready. We also need to put this rubber seal in. It has a concave area that's going to go out. It's going to kind of sit on that ball and shouldn't have to beat this in there. It should just push in. It's pretty rubbery, so that'll keep water and stuff out of there. When we grease it, the zerk hole is right here. It's going to push grease in from the back. There's a small hole in the back of this ball that allows the grease to get to the bearing. And now I think we can put the cross piece on first and then work our way out from there. So what we want to do is we want to line up our mark. So I got white marks here where a red mark was all the way at the other yoke. This is going to slide up and over, maybe. And now that that is on there, we need to get the U-joint caps installed here. And this is where, you know, it can get kind of tricky, just because everything's flopping around. You know, we don't have another drive shaft or flange hanging out here, but, you know, we're just kind of compounding the complexity. So I'm going to do the bottom cap first again. Our marks are up here. That's where our greaser goes. So I'm going to put a solid cap on the bottom. And I actually can't beat on the bench very easily without running some sort of spacer. That cap went in far enough for the snap ring to be installed. I normally like to go a little bit further, but I don't want to mess myself up too bad and drive that too deep in there. So I'm going to lift up again on this cross piece, just slightly. See if we can get this cap started. And hope none of the needle bearings fell. Grab your favorite snap-on socket. Beat that in there the rest of the way. And I think it's enough to get the other snap ring in place. Okay, that side's all put together. Now we need to get all the other pieces put together, but I want to preload my other U-joint into the other flange. And I can't really get a good swing anywhere on here. I don't want to hit the shaft that sticks out there, so I'm just going to grab a socket. This is an 1 1/8" 12-point. And remember, our greaser is going to line up with the mark, so we don't have to install the cap with the hole for the greaser quite yet. So we're going to do just the solid caps. Okay, now that I have the U-joint set in this outer flange, we need to take out that cardboard sleeve. You can take out the spring as well, because we're going to take the spring and we're going to stick it in the shaft on the other end. And that one sticks out quite a bit further. And one thing that can happen is that spring can get weak and it reduces the tension, and just lets everything kind of float around a little more. So a stronger spring should keep everything put together properly. So I have my marks lined up here, my red mark there. Now here's the challenging part. I think we got to go with an angle like that on the yoke, because we have to get this shaft lined up inside that ball socket. Now I'm just trying to get the U-joint straightened out. And I dropped a bearing in the end here. I wasn't lined up quite properly. The spring caught it and laid one of the bearings in the bottom. So I'll have to get those situated before I can go any further. Okay, I got all the needle bearings put back into place. Put a little bit heavier grease in there. Hopefully that'll keep them where they need to be. Okay, now the challenging part. This joint wants to spring load itself back out because of that spring. So we'll have to hold some spring pressure in there, get a cap started, hopefully drive it in far enough to where everything will stay put, and get the other side. Since this is where my marks are at, I want to put the cap with the greaser in. And finally, our last cap. Everything should be fairly well centered up here, just the way it's held together. So hopefully we won't drop any needle bearings, because if you do, it's very difficult to get just the one cap back off to reseat them. Go ahead and get this one snap ring on before I drive that cap in. Okay, now it's all back together. Just to make sure that all the snap rings are seated, I like to, push the caps out in each direction. So if I'm supporting the center cage here, tap there, that pushes the bottom two caps, rotate it this way. Tap there and there, that's going to push these two caps. There and there. There and there. So now I don't have any binding or anything like that. The snap rings are fully seated. All we have to do now is put all the grease zerks back in and grease it up. Okay, I think that kind of wraps it up for the double cardan joint disassembly, reassemble process. I know there's probably other ways of doing it. There's probably easier ways. There's probably more professional ways. That's the only way I know of getting them apart. I normally struggle getting them apart. Going back together normally isn't too bad, except for when I screwed up and I pushed one of the needle bearings out of that center bearing. If I hadn't stopped right there and taken it back apart, if I actually would have got some U-joint caps on it, it would have made everything a lot more difficult. So any one mistake on the double cardan joint, you'd normally have to take the entire thing back apart and start over. So luckily, I noticed that bearing dropped when it did, so I could just slide that one yoke out and spend 10 minutes of getting the bearings back into place. I did put a little bit thicker grease in there to help hold them. If you're looking to do this and you can't find parts listed, I'll show you the parts that I used. This was out of a 1996 Toyota 4Runner with the 3.4 automatic transmission. I actually used parts that I had purchased for my 95 Toyota pickup, but the center ball for the double cardan joint was a 614. I got this from Orielly's. That was the cheapest place I found it, and one of the few that had it available. Napa showed it, but it was double in price. I could have had it here in a couple days. Even the internet sources weren't much better in price. Orielly's, I think that was like 45 bucks or something. The U-joint I used in the double cardan joint was a UJ513, and that was also from Napa. So they may not have parts listed for these, but using those part numbers, you should be able to get them put back together. The race diameter, I think, was probably a thousandth or two smaller on the new one. It did go in, it just wasn't as tight as this one came out. I did have to hammer it in though. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have comments, questions, a better way of doing this, put that down below. I want to see what you guys have to say about it. And other than that, if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.